Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Mental Health Chat Monday. I'm so excited to be back here talking about mental health and mental wellness because here on Mental Health Chat Monday, our motto is turning mental illness into mental wellness. I am your host, DDare Bionic. Thank you so very much for your very, very long wait and patience for me coming back to Mental Health Chat Monday. But we're back, and I'm here with a very good friend today, someone I've known for a very long time, met doing theater. Please, my friend James, introduce yourself. Tell us your name, pronouns, how you like to be referred to. Talk to us.
Yeah, sounds great, Dieter. I'm very happy to be here talking with you today and excited about being part of the podcast. So I'm James Linsin. I go by Jamie. My pronouns are he, him, his. And I am a psychologist in private practice. I have my private practice office is in Creve Coeur. Born and raised St. Louisan. I was away for about 10, 11 years doing college and grad school and first job and stuff like that, and came back to the area in 2002. And that's quick background on me.
Good. So I just realized I threw this question, the pronouns question, on this because when I started the podcast, it wasn't as common. And then my partner was like, you definitely should throw that on there because you will have multiple people, whatever. I have never given anyone my pronouns. My pronouns are he, him, his as well. Okay, I really don't care. Usually you can call me anything. I get they, them a lot, which is totally fine with me. It's the nails and how I carry myself. So in the comments or anywhere online, if you ever see me in person, you can call me he, you can call me her, you can call me they, them. It does not matter. But usually in real life world, he, him is who I am. So Jamie, how do we know each other? How far back does our friendship go?
I was trying to think about that. And I think that we originally met through Solid Lines Productions. Yes. And so that goes back to, I want to say maybe 2013, 2014, somewhere in there.
Oh, yeah.
And so I think there were some productions that you were a part of, I think, as an actor at the time. And my role was I was kind of informally a consulting psychologist with, so Solid Lines Productions, for folks who don't know, was sadly past tense, a social justice focused theater group that did productions that had, kind of an educational purpose. We covered topics like intimate partner violence prevention, sexual assault prevention, mental health awareness, issues of diversity. And so we would do a performance, and then the performances were always followed up by a talk back with the audience, and where the actors would come back on stage. And for many of those, I served as kind of the facilitator of the talk back discussion between the audience and the actors. And sometimes when it was appropriate, I would chime in with kind of a psychologist's perspective on the issues that were being addressed. So I think that's how we met initially.
Yeah, I'm really sad about Solid Lines. I hope that they do come back someday because that was some of my favorite theater work that I've ever done.
Oh, well, yeah.
They were a very, very impactful company. And I wish everyone involved. I still am in communication with pretty much everybody that was a part of that company. They're all really close and dear friends to me. So I'm very honored to be a part of that history. And I'm glad that it brought us together.
Yeah, likewise. And such a, like you point out, such a great group of people involved in that company. And it's really been a great blessing in my life, having had that experience and maintaining those connections. So.
Yes, absolutely. So before we go any further, I like to start every single episode the same way. Mental health check. How are you doing? I know that's probably a loaded question right now, but how are you today in this moment at 11:08 a.m. on Wednesday, February 19th? How are you feeling?
Today at this moment, I'm feeling good. I am energized by a project that you and I actually are working on, which we may touch base with at the end of the podcast today. I'm excited about that. I'm going to have some more time to work on that this week. So that's really been very beneficial on a number of levels. Myself and a lot of people, including a lot of my clients, are struggling right now with just the whole socio-political atmosphere. And one of the things that I've been talking to a lot of my clients about is, find something that helps you to live out your values. And there can be a lot of different ways of doing that. But, the project that I'm working on has helped me to do that and has been really especially important, I would say, since January. Well, since the November election, but even more so since January 20th. And so that's so I'm doing well today. I'm excited, energized, and ready to go.
Yeah, I took shortly after the election, I had decided I was going to take a break from social media, and so I took like 2 months off. I came back in January, and it was the most freeing 2 months of my life to not be so attached to the phone and absorbing all of the negative and horrible things that have been happening. And like, I've been trying to do better about limiting my screen time now that I'm back, because podcasts to promote, music to promote, all the things. We all know I do everything. I do maybe too many things. I should probably slow down a little bit. But I'd love to hear, and this is where I'll kind of deviate from our tentative questions, but I'd love to hear just your thoughts on the consumption of social media from a psychologist standpoint and how that can be, especially right now, detrimental to creatives or just to people in general and how we go about our everyday life.
Yeah, I think of social media as a tool that has some very important uses, and like a lot of tools, it can create problems if used in service. I think that some of the benefits of social media, I guess this is pretty obvious, but helping people to stay connected and connected with like-minded people, and just to be able to, I'm not on social media a lot, but the reason why I haven't walked away from it entirely is because I have some folks that my main connection with them is through social media. They were living in different parts of the country. And so I think that's really, really helpful. I think that some of the challenges with social media, I think, include when, kind of as you were alluding to, I think focusing on it beyond the point of I'm staying connected and I'm enjoying this, to the point where it becomes like kind of an end in itself rather than a means to an end. I think particularly if people get pulled into kind of the rabbit hole of debates with folks that generally, I guess for some people that can be a way of expressing and venting, but I think a lot of times debates on social media don't really get resolved. I don't know that there's ever been somebody whose mind has been changed, who is very, firmly in their one position, whose mind was changed by a debate in the comment section of, somebody's post. So I think that, I think it also, social media from a psychological perspective tends to be very activating for the brain. It kind of encourages like a seeking out and a following up, and the brain's constantly looking for new things and new forms of stimulation. And especially, like, just to cite one example, like when I've got clients who are having trouble falling asleep at night, I'll talk to them about, well, what do you do before you go to bed? And a lot of them will say, well, I just surf the internet. I scroll through social media.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll point out to them, not that there's anything wrong with doing that per se, but it does tend to be very activating. And if you're having challenges with kind of racing thoughts and it's hard to quiet them down and intrusive worries, obsessively going through social media tends to fuel that fire in what can be unhelpful ways. So just as you noticed kind of some more peacefulness from stepping away from it, I guess my thought with it is, again, I'm not saying social media is bad. What I'm saying is, find a balance where it's working for you. And if you find yourself getting uncomfortably stirred up by it, maybe experiment with, as you did, taking a certain amount of time away from it and see, if that helps you.
I highly, highly recommend it. And I fully agree. I don't think social media is inherently bad. I think it's kind of become a little bit of a cesspool of negative emotions on both sides. We all are, like you said, no fights are being resolved. It's a screaming match in the comment section. I stay out of the comment sections. But that's a very, very poignant point. I encourage everybody to take some time on social media, even if it's just a couple days. It's so good. Yeah. So I want to dive into our topics here. So I think it's kind of a moot point to ask you this, but why is mental health awareness important to you, and how did you decide to become a psychiatrist?
Yeah, well, it's my story about how it became important to me is completely entwined with, as you mentioned, how I came to my chosen profession. So mental health awareness is important as somebody who has suffered from recurrent bouts of depression over the course of my life. I'd say starting when I was about 11, and I'd say probably I would estimate about 7 episodes of depression over the course of my life since then, some more severe than others. But so, and at the time, when I was going through this sort of thing in high school, this was back in the early 80s. This was before Prozac and other SSRIs medications came out. And there really wasn't any kind of societal discussion that I was aware of, at least, about depression, about mental illness in general. So I felt very isolated with what I was going through at the time. It also left me, though, with kind of a sense of curiosity about, when I got to the other side of it, it's like, what is it that can cause the brain to go in these horrible, bleak, distorted directions? So when I got to college, I was interested in taking psych classes because I kind of wanted to learn more about it. And the more classes I took, the more engaged I found it. And, also learned about, ways that counseling, skilled listening can help people. And so that became, both a personal and a professional priority for me. Knowing firsthand what it's like to go through mental illness kind of helped motivate me to want to try to help others who also might be feeling stuck in that place and might be feeling alone and isolated with it. So the short answer to your question is mental health awareness is important for me, both as someone who has struggled with those kind of issues and also someone who has dedicated my career to trying to help people move beyond them.
Wow. My favorite thing about this podcast is getting to know more about people that I'm already friends with. And like, everybody's story is so different, but there's just the way it all kind of works out and kind of comes together, and the relatability of it. It's beautiful. It really is beautiful. So you talked a little bit about how, since you were 11, you've had these recurring depressive episodes. Have you ever received like an official diagnosis or anything like that?
Yeah, I've gotten a few different diagnoses. I mean, I would say, um, I would say probably the diagnosis I would most typically apply to myself if I'm going through an episode at the time would be major depressive disorder, recurrent. And the research shows that a person who has had one depressive episode, there's a 50% chance that they'll experience another. And every subsequent episode after that kind of increases the likelihood of another one coming down the line at some point. So that's probably, the diagnosis that fits me. But I was alluding to this in the previous answer that when I was first going through this, so when I was, I would say in sixth and seventh grade mainly, so about 11 years old, I started seeing a psychiatrist. And at the time, I did not know that I was dealing with a thing called depression. My awareness of it at the time, or the way I would have explained it to you at the time, was that I was really anxious about school. I would get really worried about, am I doing well enough in my classes? And I was kind of perfectionistic, and I would get really discouraged, and I'd have these crying spells. And I just thought that I'm just a stressed out kid who is very perfectionistic, and that creates problems for me. And so the psychiatrist I was seeing then, I don't have any recollection of him saying to me, you have this disorder and it's called depression. I think that would have been helpful for me to know at the time. I know that there can be a certain amount of stigma around diagnoses, and there are actually some thoughtful, reasonable discussions happening around, what are the implications of assigning a diagnosis to someone. I think for me, though, the first two bouts of depression I had, so I was first when I was 11 and then when I was 15, in both of those cases, I didn't know that what I was going through was something called depression. And again, at the time, this second bout would have been in 1985. There really wasn't very much awareness about it. I mean, thanks to podcasts like yours and other resources, I think more people now at least know that this is an issue, and there's more of a, base of understanding of that. But at the time, I did not know I even had a diagnosis. I just thought there was something wrong with me, that I was just too weak of a person to be able to handle stress as well as everybody else did.
Yeah, I can relate to that because, in the way that I can relate to that is when I was going through my first bouts of depression, when I was like probably 13 or 14, there was a name for it. I didn't know if that's exactly what it was, but there was at least research that had been done and things that I could look up and be like, okay, this kind of sounds like what's happening to me.
Right.
So it's interesting to hear, I was in my teens in the 2010s. Wow, that's hilarious to think about that I was in my teens in the 2010s. But, 15 or so years ago, I was, in my teens, and there was so much more research than just 20 years before that. It's interesting so how do you see the world of psychology and counseling and all of that? How do you see that changing from when you started becoming a counselor, when you started your classes and psych classes in college, to now as a professional in 2025? What changes have you seen?
One of the things that I have seen is that the rates of depression and anxiety have really shot up. I started grad school in August of 93. And since that time, the rates are just getting higher. At that time, the number one presenting concern for counselors' offices in terms of like diagnoses was depression. And I would say as of about 10, 15 years ago, it flipped. It used to be depression was number one and anxiety, some type of anxiety disorder was number two. And now it's flipped. We're seeing more anxiety than depression. And I think that that kind of naturally sort of leads to a question of why is that happening? And there is a lot of debate about that. My understanding of it, based on the research that I've read, is that as human beings, our stress response system, we inherited a very primitive stress response system that for our cave person ancestors really was well suited to the stresses at the time. You've heard of fight or flight, and back then a lot of the stresses we had to deal with was, being able to hunt down food, being able to run away from things that were chasing us. And so that system is designed to be very activating, but activating for brief periods of time. Mm-hmm. So like if, a cave person way back in prehistoric times is being chased by, I don't know, a saber-toothed tiger or something like that, the stress fight or flight system gets activated. The cave person hopefully is able to get away from the tiger. And once they get away from the tiger, the immediate stress subsides. And what we see nowadays is we still have that stress response system that's well suited for brief, stressors that mainly call for a physiological response. Nowadays, we're all dealing with, it tends to be chronic stressors and things that we can't easily do physical battle with or run away from. Mm-hmm. So I think part of the reason why we're seeing so much more depression and anxiety is that we have like stress response systems that are kind of chronically being activated. And psychologically, we weren't designed for those to be, to be in fight or flight mode most of the time. So I think so again, in answer to your question, the main thing I've seen is an increase in, pervasiveness of particularly depression and anxiety. And I think that's some of one of the underlying factors there.
Yeah, that makes sense. I've never thought about it that way, but yeah, we are kind of, and I've heard a lot of my friends describe themselves, especially when they're anxious and like fight or flight mode all the time.
Yeah.
And it really is like a primitive system of, we can't run from the things that are constantly rolling around in our head.
Right.
So moving to kind of in that same vein of things. So we call mental health issues, oftentimes we call them invisible illnesses. I've heard the term used a lot. I'm still kind of trying to figure out my feelings on the term, and I'm wondering what your feelings on the term are.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that there's more visibility and much more awareness now than there used to be. Again, thanks to podcasts like yours, thanks to there are, awareness walks, there are educational initiatives, and those are super important and super helpful. So in that sense, there is a little bit more visibility, but I think that despite all that, I think there still can be a great deal of stigma around struggling with this sort of thing. And a job that I had, the worst bout of depression I've ever been through happened about 9 years ago. And at the time I was in a leadership position in, kind of the mental health field. And I was dealing with a really, really bad bout of depression. And part of what made it as hard as it was I felt like I couldn't really let anybody know because I was at that time the person in charge of that one particular office. And so, and here I am as a psychologist, and I work hard to help reduce stigma where I can. When I work with clients, I always tell them, this is nothing to be embarrassed about. It's an illness like any other. But yet, I fell into that, stigma. And, I've thought, going back to that time, if I was dealing with something that wasn't depression, that wasn't a mental illness, like if I was dealing with, I guess the best example I can think of, I have a friend who about 15 years ago went through a bout of Lyme disease, which I didn't really know anything about, but was just terrible. I mean, it put her kind of out of commission for the better part of a year. Like she wasn't able to work and all of this stuff. And which was horrible. And not that I wish that I had had an illness like that, but just for comparison purposes, I think if I had an illness like that, that wasn't something that was going to resolve in a week or two, that was going to be an ongoing thing, I really think I would have been, I wouldn't have made a big deal out of it, but I think I would have let everybody on staff know, hey, this is what I'm dealing with. And I would have expected to get, support and understanding. And I think I would have felt a lot more comfortable about taking time off work as needed to deal with it. And as it was back then, I did not miss a day. There were some days when it was really, really hard to get out of bed. And I had to do very much a stepwise, okay, just get out of bed first, just do that. And it's like, okay, just take a shower, just, and, I would just kind of have these little hurdles that I would have to go over. And even with all of that, I did not miss a day of work because of it. And I don't say that as a badge of pride. It may sound like kind of a humble brag, but I really don't mean it like that, because I think if I had taken some time off, it probably would have helped me to get through it more quickly, or at least if I would have allowed myself the grace, instead of saying, I must keep this inside, no one must know, I have to put this front like I'm still on top of things. I think I made it harder for myself in the process. So I guess that's a long-winded way of saying, I think that even though there's more awareness now, which is awesome, I think it's still not an easy subject to discuss and to disclose to other people. And I think that fact is partly what makes it, so hard to manage, because I think there are a lot of people like me who do keep it inside, and that kind of adds to the isolation of it and the self-imposed pressure and all of that. So.
I 100% relate to you on that. I am definitely a keeper insider. I definitely am a keep it to yourself. Nobody needs to know. My thing is always, I don't want to burden people with what's burdening me. Mm-hmm, and everybody around me is always like, you don't have to go through this alone. You're not alone. And I am continuing to work toward being better about, being open and being vulnerable. Vulnerability is something that's very difficult for me at 32 years old. I've been working on it my whole life. Yeah. This podcast is like the most vulnerable I have ever been. This podcast and the play that I wrote, My Infinite Sadness, are like, it's easy for me to get it out in my art, my music and theater, but just everyday life, it feels like it's choking. And so I'm a worker. I was actually just talking to my partner about this last night. Like when I'm going through a really heavy bout of depression, I'm at the computer, I'm knocking out my whole entire to-do list in a few hours. And sometimes I do wish I could, like you said, give myself the grace to just be like, just sit on the couch.
Mm-hmm. Right. Absolutely.
Just sit on the couch and turn your brain off. But it feels crazy to do that. So I relate to you very deeply on that one, my friend. Yeah. So I recently had my first grief counseling session. It was great. And therapy is a very powerful tool. It is something that I advocate for wholeheartedly for every person, whether you've been diagnosed or not, how have you utilized therapy throughout your journey, and how do you see therapy change, maybe not necessarily the lives, but the outlooks of people you have worked with, if you can share that? I know there's
absolutely. I think for myself personally, I've used therapy as a helpful tool throughout my life. I've been fortunate to have had some really outstanding therapists that I've seen. And it's funny because when I think back to what was the most helpful about those really great therapists that I worked with, I don't really remember like specific. I mean, with one or two exceptions, I don't remember like specific things they said that was like, oh, you totally changed my perspective. And, that, in the field, we'll call it an intervention, right? You make an intervention with a client as a counselor and, you hope the interventions are helpful. But what I recall is not so much a specific intervention or a specific statement or reframe. I just recall that these were caring people who were skilled listeners, who I knew were on my side and who were understanding and supportive. And, there's more to it than that, but that's really what stands out for me. And there was an interesting book that I read when I was in grad school. And it's called Every Day Gets a Little Closer. And it was written in collaboration by a psychiatrist, Dr. Irvin Yalom, and one of his patients. And they agreed that they would write a book together. And nowadays it would be important to be very careful about that and make sure it's set up in a way that's not exploitive and doesn't create like a dual relationship and that sort of thing. And I think that Yalom did a pretty good job of setting that up. But anyway, one of the takeaways from the book is both the psychiatrist and the client after each session would take notes on what they thought was most impactful about the session. And so what Yalom wrote, and he didn't think that every session was he's realistic enough that he's not like, oh, I was great today. He'll call himself out in the book. Like, I don't think that went very well. But the sessions that he thought went well, what he was writing down as significant were the interventions, I made this interpretation and the client really seemed to respond to that. And we were able to make connections with childhood issues and that sort of thing. And it was interesting because the client would also say that the sessions were helpful, but she didn't really talk about the interventions. And when they kind of did a summary at the end of what had been helpful over the course of therapy, what the psychiatrist was talking about again was the intervention and the treatment plan. What the client said was, it was very poignantly simple. When the client was asked by Dr. Yalom, what was the most helpful part of working together? The client said, honestly, doctor, the most helpful part was I had a sense that you liked me. So it comes back to, and research does seem to support this, that the most significant correlation of what is associated with beneficial change in counseling, interestingly enough, it's not the theoretical orientation of the counselor. It's not, the age of the counselor. It's not even the years of experience of the counselor. The most important predictor of success in counseling is the quality of that therapeutic relationship. Is it safe? Is it supportive? Are there good boundaries there? Does the client feel, a sense of, that alliance? So for me, that's what I recall. And then, in the course of what I've seen sitting in the counselor's chair with my clients, honestly, I think a lot of what I do is, kind of normalize and validate. I think a lot of people come in with what I call kind of these two layers that they're dealing with. There's one layer that's the psychological pain and distress and what's causing the main challenges. And then the second layer, I think, is how we tend to respond to ourselves. So like me, during my bouts of depression, if I go back to the time like 9 years ago, I was really very punitive with myself. I was like, I need to be handling this better. I can't let on that I'm having problems. Why aren't I strong enough to manage this? And I think a lot of folks come into therapy with that second layer. It's how do I respond to myself in my distress? And so I think a lot of what I do is kind of normalize and say, it makes sense that this is hard for you right now. This doesn't say anything about your worth as a person, your strength as a person. You're dealing with some really hard circumstances. And so, a lot of what I do is try to help clients be on their own side and be aware of that kind of harshly punitive way that, our thoughts can respond to us, and to try to get some distance from those. And I think that serves as the foundation for a lot of where that positive change happens.
I am so honored to have you on this episode. I just feel like I know that somebody is going to watch this and just get a better understanding of not only their own mental, struggles, but also of how to find a good counselor and what to look for in someone, the qualities. And, I just, knowing that there are real human beings out in the world that care so deeply, but also have the struggles and can separate those two things in order to, provide a service for someone and provide care and support and safety to someone is just such a beautiful thing. It's such beautiful qualities that you have, Jamie. It really, really, truly is.
Oh, thank you, DDare. I really appreciate that.
You're very welcome. I appreciate you so much. So I want to just briefly talk about medication. It's not something that comes up often. It's not something that I have ever had to have been prescribed as far as like mental illness medication. I do have my high blood pressure pills. That's new for me. But what are your thoughts and feelings on medication and the like?
Well, again, that's like I was talking about earlier with diagnoses. There is a healthy debate to be had about medication and the use of medication. Throughout my life on a lot of issues, I tend to look for. Let me rephrase that. I've found that the truth is often not an all or nothing thing. And I tend to, when I hear people talking in extremes, I naturally tend to try to see, is there some validity and truth to be found in the middle of that? And so what I mean by that is there are some people who say all psychotropic medications are bad and they should be eliminated and they're awful. And then there are some who say, no, these are biological illnesses and medication is absolutely essential for treating them. And again, that's one of those cases where I fall somewhat in the middle. I think there are some problems with overusing certain medications. I think there are some disparities in how certain medications are prescribed. Research has shown, just to cite one example, that regardless of what the presenting concern is, women who go in to see their either primary care physician or OBGYN are much more likely, and we're not talking about going to see a psychiatrist or going to see a counselor. We're talking about women and men who go into like primary care physicians' offices presenting with all the different things that people can bring in. Women are much more likely than men to leave that appointment with a prescription for some kind of psychotropic medication, like Prozac or Xanax or something like that, again, regardless of the presenting problem. So, clearly there's a disparity there. And so, I think, again, there can be some problems with that. At the same time, I can say for myself that psychotropic medications have made a huge difference over time. And I've worked with clients for whom medications were a vital part of helping them to stay balanced. And again, at the same time, I've worked with folks who either medications didn't work for them, or they tried a medication, but they felt like it made the problem worse, or just kind of philosophically and in terms of their values, they really wanted to try to get through it without. And I totally respect that. If I'm working with somebody for whom I really strongly think that a medication would be a very important adjunct to treatment, I'll point that out to them. I can't prescribe myself. I'm a psychologist, not a psychiatrist. But if I think that's something that would be helpful, I'll point it out. But also, I respect people's choice not to do that. So again, kind of a middle ground answer. I think medications aren't an all or nothing thing. I think they do a lot of good for a lot of people. And I think for some people, they can become problematic, or there are people who find that they really do better without them. So again, I understand voices on the extremes like all or nothing, but in my experience, I think the reality is much more in the middle. There's good and bad to them.
Yeah, there's a gray area when it comes to it. That's what I've seen in my experience with friends and family who have needed or been prescribed and liked it, didn't like it, whatever, what have you. I've seen, I would agree there's a gray area there. Nothing is all or nothing. Yeah. So we're kind of rounding out our episode here, but we've got a few more things we want to talk about, specifically this project that we are working on in collaboration. So, but before we get to that, here on Mental Health Chat Monday, our motto is turning mental illness into mental wellness. My friend Jamie, what does mental wellness mean to you?
Mental wellness. I sort of think of mental wellness as, it's kind of like people, I've heard people who say, happiness is not a destination, it's a journey. And so I think mental wellness is not a destination. I think it's more of a series of choices. And so I think some of the choices that tend to promote mental wellness, some things that I think are kind of important for all of us as human beings, just like plants need a certain amount of sunlight, a certain amount of water, temperatures within a certain range. I think there are a certain number of things that most human beings need on some level to be optimally balanced. And the optimal level is different for different people. So like, for example, you look at like introverts versus extroverts. There are some people who do best with a lot of friends that maybe they kind of know a lot of them more casually, but they like to go out, with big groups of people and all that. There are introverts who do better with a smaller number of friends that they're closer to. So again, there can be individual differences, but I think most of us, if not all of us, do best when we have some sense of social connection, with preferably with at least one person who I would say gets us. It's like I'm fortunate enough, and I'm sure you are too, to have, people who just get me. I don't have to be anything but myself. And I think doesn't have to be a ton of people, but I think having at least one person in one's life that can be that role is important. And I think in terms of relationships, whether we're talking about friends or partners, or family members, I think ideally part of having that connection is that there's a back and forth. I think it's not just what we get from the people in our lives. I think it's what we're able to give and share with them. It feels, for most of us, it feels good to be able to help somebody else, and, it feels good to, do things to let other people know that we care about them. So I think that's very important. I think that as human beings, I think we all need a certain amount of sunlight, literally. Not everybody deals with seasonal affective disorder by any means, but I think that, and we kind of saw this in the pandemic too, at least I did, that like most of us, I was kind of cooped up in the house. And in September of 2020, I joined this outdoor trail running group that would, as the name implies, we would run on hiking trails through the area. And that, I don't have the words for how beneficial that was. And I think a lot of it was being outside in nature. I mean, it was just revitalizing, quite literally. And so I think sunlight is important. There's growing research now that shows that being in nature itself is really important. There's a term I've heard recently called forest bathing that I think originated in the Far East, where, healthcare providers are seeing benefits when they tell people to literally just go out in the woods or into nature and just, you don't even necessarily have to do anything according to the research for it to be beneficial. Even just kind of going out and sitting there for like a half hour and just kind of taking in the sounds and the sights and the smells and all of that stuff seems to be really important. Another thing that I think is super important for mental wellness is having, and this actually would kind of segue into our project, I suppose, at least personally for me, but I talk with a lot of clients about the importance of having something that gives you a sense of engagement, a sense of purpose, a sense of having something fulfilling and to do. The folks that I work with who tend to be the most stressed out, in a lot of cases, those are people who their lives are limited to like, I get up, I eat, I go to work, I come home, I eat, I, stare at TV or social media, I go to bed, I get up and do the same thing. And part of the problem with that is that, you really, you're either kind of an employee or you're, a friend or a partner or a family member or whatever. But it's kind of, if it's just, this is what I have to do to earn money, and this is what I have to do to get a break from what I have to do to earn money, that tends to be pretty limiting. So having something, and I mean, it can be a hobby, it can be, a volunteer activity, it could be being involved with a book club, it could be being involved with a pickleball group, it could be, but I think a lot of it, one of the foundational psychologist, psychiatrist who's been influential for me over my career is a guy named Dr. Alfred Adler, who is a contemporary of Freud's. And one of the things, and he had a German term for it that I would probably mangle if I tried to pronounce, but for him, a key component of mental health was for people to have something that helped them to feel like they were giving back to the community. Not out of a sense of obligation, but out of a sense of I am connected, I am part of a larger community. and I'm doing something that has a benefit, but also helps me to feel like, I have something worthwhile to offer. So I think having a sense that I'm part of a larger community, I have something worthwhile to offer, I think becomes vitally, vitally important.
I wholeheartedly agree. I always say if I was just working my restaurant job, and I love my job, I've been there officially 8 years as of February 14th. I have been at my job 8 years.
Awesome.
I love the place that I work and I love the people that I work with, most of them. That's life. But if I wasn't creating something, if I wasn't doing theater or music or something outside of that, I would be in a very intense downward spiral.
Yes.
It has to come out some way. And it does feel like you're giving something back to the world. I say all the time, my art is used to heal the world. Every single thing that I do, no matter if it's theater, music, or this podcast, it's all for healing the world. And it is very rewarding to be a creative and to have purpose in that way, for me at least. And I know for a lot of us other creative people. And that does segue us very beautifully into the project that we're working on. So please.
Yeah, absolutely. So DDare and I are working on a transgender affirming theater project. It's a form of theater called documentary theater. And documentary theater, there are other terms for it, but it uses material from interviews. It uses material from news articles, statements that are in the public record, news headlines, that sort of thing, to create a play to highlight a relevant issue. A good example of this type of theater for people who might not be familiar with it, I think a lot of folks have heard of the Laramie Project, which is about Matthew Shepard's tragic murder, and a group called the Tectonic Theater Project traveled to Laramie, Wyoming in the aftermath of Matthew Shepard's murder and interviewed people in the town at the university where Matthew had attended college, and to kind of get their thoughts about the whole tragic situation. What did it say about the community of Laramie? How had it changed the people who live there? Just an amazingly brilliant work of theater. And there are many, many, many more examples of that kind of theater. So anyway, for this project, what we're doing is I've conducted interviews, I think 27 to date, with folks who are in the transgender community, people who are allies, including like parents of transgender folks, loved ones of transgender folks, partners, healthcare providers, so counselors, transgender affirming physicians. I interviewed a legislator, and I've also transcribed some of the public hearings in Jeff City about the horrible anti-trans legislation that's, seems like tragically is now getting worse than it was before. So the goal is to take all of that material and use it to create a play that has a narrative flow to it and is engaging. And the goal is to highlight, to shine a light on, transgender folks living their lives and the joys and the challenges that they experience, and emphasizing common humanity. Transgender people are being used as scapegoats and they're being marginalized. And just to emphasize, all of this horrible rhetoric is targeting people who are just trying to live their lives like we all are. And then a second purpose is to call out the anti-trans legislation, the cynical and perhaps out and out bigoted is maybe a better word, motivations underlying it, and to kind of call it out for what it is and to point out the devastating impact of anti-trans legislation. So So that's what you and I are working on, and we're actually going to meet on Saturday to kind of talk about. I've kind of gotten to the point where I'm getting ready to start putting the script together, and I have some ideas about what the narrative flow of it might look like. And I would not be doing this without you, Darius, with your insight and wisdom and experience as a script writer, as a director, as an actor. And I just couldn't be more excited about being able to collaborate with you on this project. So
I am so appreciative and like so thankful that you reached out to me to be a part of this project. In case anybody was wondering, this is a safe space for trans people of all shapes, sizes, colors. Everybody is welcome here on the Mental Health Chat Monday podcast. That is our stance. That is the truth. That is life. Trans people are people. They are human beings, and they deserve life, a long, everlasting life. So I am honored, blessed, and amazed to be a part of this project. I can't wait. Are we? We'll actually talk about that after we get off the call. I don't want we'll talk about the actual meeting when we get off the call. But yeah, I'm so excited about this project, especially since we've already collaborated on so many theater projects in kind of a different sense with Solid Lines and with my play, My Infinite Sadness. You are our sitting consulting psychologist for that as well.
That was such a wonderful piece of work, and it was such an honor to be a part of that. Just kudos to you for just excellent artistic work. So
thank you so much. I'm sorry, my mom just called me. I just want to text her real quick. Yes, it is to this day my crowning achievement, My Infinite Sadness. It is my favorite thing that I've ever done. I'm working right now to translate it from a stage play to a screenplay and hopefully do like a short film of some form with it.
Awesome.
So I will see what happens. I'm working on the transcribing. Or not transcribing, but the adaptation. Right. So hopefully, fingers crossed this year, that's something that happens. But I am so excited about this project. I can't wait to talk more about it and bring everybody into the fold and get really into the nitty gritty of making this thing a real show and putting it on its feet. It's going to be so amazing.
Yeah, I'm very excited. So.
Very, very excited. Is there anything else you would like to promote? Your practice, anything like that?
I can't really think of anything. Just so happy and honored that you invited me on your podcast. I just think it's great what you're doing, and mental health awareness. I don't think it can be said too many times to let people know that help is available. It's sadly it's not easy to access help these days, especially for folks in marginalized communities, folks with lower socioeconomic status. But there is help out there. And if a person feels like they don't even know how to find help on their own, because that can be pretty daunting. It's like, I know I need help, but I don't even know where to start. There's people out there who can help get you matched up, even if you don't know where to start. A good place to start for folks who don't really know where to begin, I would say, crisis hotlines can be a good place to start. There's a national crisis line. The nationwide number is 988. Which is great because it's super easy to remember, and it kind of unites a lot of crisis lines under one umbrella, which I think is good. But don't hesitate, even if it's like to a trusted friend or calling a crisis hotline, or if you're suffering, if you're struggling. There are people who will be happy to help you, and you do not have to go through it alone. So.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that is the point of this podcast, and the point of every single guest I bring on this podcast is to remind people that they don't have to go through this alone. And the crisis hotline number will be in the description of this video. I put that on every single video. And I'm glad you reminded me to do that because I haven't done this in a long time. All right, our final topic. Leave us with just one piece of advice for those who are on their own mental health journey, and one piece of advice for allies of those of us with mental illnesses.
I think on their own mental health journey, I would say, especially for folks who are stuck in depression, where the thoughts are kind of twisted toward self-rejection. For people who are on this journey, don't lose sight of the strength that you have. Life is difficult enough, even for people who are blessed enough to not be struggling with mental illness. We all have our struggles. Those who are carrying a burden of mental illness, it makes everything a lot more difficult. And like me, when I've been through this, I have felt and kind of told myself that I'm going through this because I'm too weak. But it actually takes a lot of strength just to kind of keep going, and to reach out for help takes a lot of strength. It takes vulnerability. It takes courage. So don't lose sight of the fact, for those who are on the journey, don't lose sight of the fact that you have inner reserves of strength that you can draw from, and that you don't have to carry the burden all by yourself. And I think for allies, I would say it doesn't take a lot to make a really positive difference for somebody. Even taking the time with a friend to just taking a few seconds to send a text and say, I know you've been having a hard time lately. Just wanted to check in and see how you're doing. Taking a few extra minutes to listen when somebody needs to talk. Even something like, hey, I know you're having kind of a rough time. Why don't we get together for coffee or something? Little things like that can make a huge difference. So just taking the time to recognize somebody, to let somebody know you're thinking of them, to just, and just be a friend. I'll often tell clients that there are things that friends and allies can do that I, as a counselor, can't. I can't, say to a client, hey, you probably need to get out of the house. Let's go see a movie. Or let's meet for a cup of coffee. Or, we're having a game night and getting some people together. Why don't you come over? So allies have a very important role to play. And I would say, don't lose sight of what a positive difference you can make just by being a friend, just by taking, we're all busy, we're all spread pretty thin, but it doesn't take a lot of time to really make a positive difference in somebody's life. So.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Thank you for being my first recording back. Thank you for
Absolutely.
being interested and excited, and all of your insights. This has been an absolutely beautiful episode. I'm so excited to share it with everybody. Thank you for just being here and being you. I'm so happy. I'm so amazed. Thank you.
Thank you, DDare. So appreciative, and hello to all of your listeners, and just keep up the good work with all of your endeavors. So I know
y'all can't see it. Y'all can't see it, but I'm smiling ear to ear right now. I'm buzzing with good energy. This is really. I needed this. It's been a rough couple of days, some family stuff. And so I really needed this conversation to happen today. So I'm very grateful. And I am also grateful to all of you who are tuned in to Mental Health Chat Monday. Thank you for waiting on me to come back. I promise I'm back. And I will see you all next Monday with a brand new episode. Of course, my name is DDare Bionic. You can find me everywhere on all social media at DDare Bionic. It's called branding. Look it up. I'll see you next week. Love you. Mean it. Mwah. Bye.